Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Sorry for the change of schedule multiple times, but because my flight was canceled, I was able, Baruch Hashem, to steal a room here in the Young Israel of Houston. Rabbi Wender's brother is the Rav here. A special thank you to him and his shul for allowing me to steal a room here. So we're going to be learning Maseches Succah, Daf Lamed Hey, and we're starting at the Mishnah toward the bottom of Lamed Daled Amud Beis. 2 days ago, we spoke about Hadassim, and then we spoke about Aravos. And today, we're going to be speaking about Esrog. We'll be learning from the Mishnah on the bottom of Lamed Daled Amud Beis, all the way toward the bottom of Lamed Hey Amud Beis in my Gemara. It's about 3 lines before the bottom of the page. Let's get started. The Mishnah writes on Lamed Daled Amud Beis, Esrog hagazul v'hayavish pasol. If there's an esrog that's stolen or an esrog that is dried out, it is pasol. Shel ashera v'shel ir hanitachas. If it is from a tree that was worshipped or from a community that was mostly of idol worshippers, then pasol. Shel orla pasol. If the esrog was from an orla tree, the halacha by orla is that for a new tree, all the fruits in the first 3 years are usher to be eaten because of the mitzvah of orla. And in the 4th year, the fruits can be eaten. So if the tree that is in discussion is a tree of orla, and it's an esrog tree, so the halacha is in the Mishnah that it is pasol. I have to ask in the Gemara, who cares if we're not eating it? Who cares if the esrog is part of an orla tree? Who cares if it's tamei because of truma? It doesn't make a difference. At the end of the day, we're just using it al mitzvah, but we're not eating it. We'll discuss that in the Gemara. So that's what the Gemara says by orla, that shel orla pasol. Shel truma tmeya pasol. And on a similar note, just like orla is not allowed because it's aser be'achila, the same is true here, that truma, which is tmeya, is also pasol. What about truma tahora? So says the Gemara, says the Mishnah, shel truma tahora lo yito. Really, you should not use an esrog that is truma tahora, even though it's edible and even though there's nothing wrong with it, there's no tuma. Lo yito, you should not. We'll learn in the Gemara why. However, unlike orla, where if you try to do the mitzvah with an esrog from an orla tree, you are not yotze. Here says the Mishnah, v'im not al kasher, that if one were to take the mitzvah, take an esrog from a tree that was truma tahora, then the halacha is that you're yotze. Shel demai. Demai is food or fruit or vegetables that you got from an am haaretz. And by an am haaretz, we always have a suffix as to whether or not they were ma'aser. So what does the Mishnah do about this? This is a standing machlokes throughout Shas. So here, party lines, Beis Shammai poslan Beisel machshirin. Beis Shammai says that the mitzvah by esrog would be that it's pasol. That does not work here. Beisel says it's fine. What about shel meiser sheni b'Yerushalayim? So that lo yito, you should not do that, even though the food's not tamei, it's not aser be'achila. Lehefech, you're dafka supposed to eat it in Yerushalayim. So you should not do it for reasons we'll see in the Gemara. V'im not al kasher. However, b'diavad, if one did so, you would still be yotze. Next, also chazazis al rubo. Let's say that there were these types of like little bubbles or boils that were all on rove, on the majority of the esrog, and or natla pitma. So if the pitom fell off, if you're looking for the marimakom for when somebody breaks off the pitom, it's this Mishnah on Lamed Daled Amud Beis. Niklaf, if it got peeled, or nistak, if it generated a crack or a crevice inside the esrog, or nikev v'chaser, or if there was a hole that was made in it, and this is a very important word, and therefore some of the flesh was missing, some of the flesh of the esrog, kol shehu, and even a small amount, the halacha is pasol. However, says the Mishnah, we're 6-7 lines from the bottom, Lamed Daled Amud Beis. The Mishnah says, "Alsa chazazes sal miyuta." What if only less than 50% was had these types of little bumps on them, these boils, or natal oktso, not the pitom, the fragile part of the top, but the oketz is the bottom part, the part that actually connects to the tree, like we're familiar with seeing from other fruits and vegetables also. So by the oketz, if you took that, or nikev v'lo, let's say that you stick a pin into an esrog and then pull it out. So yes, there's a hole nikev, but here there's nothing that's chaser. No flesh was removed. There may be some moisture on the needle that you stuck in, but nothing was removed. So the halacha is v'lo chaser kol shu, and nothing's missing. The halacha is kosher. Esrog hakushi. This is an esrog that comes from the land of Ethiopia. And Rashi highlights here that we're talking about a very dark looking type of esrog. And actually in the picture books, looks like an avocado. They're very, very dark. So the halacha is pasol. The hayaro kikarsi, if it has this type particular shade of green, the halacha is Rav Meir Machshir Rabbi Yehuda Posa. What about shiur esrog? So this we spoke about already, but this is actually the proper marimakom to learn this. So the Mishnah here writes 3-4 lines from the bottom of Lamed Daled Amud Beis. What's the minimum shiur hakatan? The smallest shiur of Meir Omer ke'egos, even the size of a walnut, as long as it's ripe, no problem. Rabbi Yehuda Omer kebeitza. It has to be a minimum shiur b'kibetza, which is of course larger. What's the largest maximal size? So it says the Gemara uvegadol kadesh yochas shnayim biyado achas. To Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda was of the opinion that it had to be that you were able to hold both in one hand. And on the last line of Lamed Daled Amud Beis, the last line of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi Omer, afilu echad b'shtei yadav, even if there was only one fruit in both of your hands. We're thinking about a watermelon, a cantaloupe. You're talking about a seriously sized esrog, and he is super mekil to say that that would be allowed. This brings us to the top of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Aleph as the Gemara opens. Tanu Rabbanan, how do we know that when the pasuk says in Chumash Pri Eitz Hadar that it's actually talking about an esrog? So the Brisa darshans as follows. The Brisa says that, the Brisa says as follows. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis have taught us that Pri Eitz Hadar means eitz shatam eitzo upirio shaveh, that when the flavor of the tree and the flavor of the fruit are the same, under those circumstances, that is how you know you have found an esrog. Have omer ze esrog. Now the Meforshim here explain that, of course, the bark of the tree doesn't taste mamish like an esrog that you'd close your eyes in the taste test and get confused. What it means is that just like the esrog has a citrusy type of flavor to it, so too, if one were to taste the bark, there would be a citrusy type of flavor to it. But the Gemara says, hang on one second. I know another type of growth that would fall under the category of Pri Eitz Hadar, and the bark tastes a little bit like the fruit. What's that? Second line, ve'ema pilpulin. Maybe we should say pepper. Pepper, of course, grows in these spherical peppercorns. Maybe we should say that. How do we know that that is the case, that its wood tastes like the pepper itself, that it has that peppery type of flavor? Shene'emar, the pasuk says in regards to the mitzvah of orla, untatem kol eitz, and the next word in the pasuk is ma'achal. So it's fruit cheese. We're talking about orla. So if you're going to say eitz, any yodeshu eitz ma'achal, why does the pasuk bother saying the word eitz and ma'achal? Ma'atam lomer eitz ma'achal, eitz shetam eitzo upirio shaveh. Because we must be talking about something where the bark has a similar flavor to the actual produce on the tree. And what is that? Have omer ze pilpulin. So within this brisa, we see that there's a common denominator between esrogin and pilpulin. They both check off the same boxes in that they fulfill the words of Pri Eitz Hadar, in that the flavoring of the bark is reminiscent of the flavoring of the actual produce of the tree. And within this brisa, what do we see? L'lamedcha. This teaches us a couple of things. First of all, it teaches us l'lamedcha she'pilpulin chayavin be'orla. Maybe we would have thought that not every spice that grows is going to be chayiv in orla. It's not a fruit. It's not a vegetable proper. Nevertheless, the halacha is that pepper is chayiv in orla. And also, another thing that we learn from this brisa is ve'in eretz Yisrael chaseira klum. Nothing is missing. Even peppercorns, the Eretz Yisrael can grow anything. Shene'emar, as the Torah says, lo sechsar kol ba. So that is that nothing is missing. And this is really a question. And the question is as follows. We started out on the top of this page by saying that the esrog is defined by that which has the bark tasting similar to the produce of the tree. So asks the Gemara, but the same exact thing is true by pilpulin. So how do we know? Could you imagine how unique it would be if you'd walk into shul? You have a lulav hadassim and a ravas in one hand and a tiny little peppercorn beet in the other. But it seems to check off those boxes. So how do we know, asks the Gemara, that the mitzvah of Pri Eitz Hadar is not talking about peppercorns? So the Gemara gives a pretty crazy answer. The Gemara says, in theory, it could work, except for the following. We're about 10 lines down, Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. Hasam mishum delo efshar. You're right that it checks off all the boxes. Yes, the flavoring of the bark of the peppercorn is similar in that it has the peppery taste of the peppercorn. However, Hasam, by the pepper, we can't say that it's Pri Eitz Hadar. Delo efshar. Why are we not able to do that? Because says the Gemara, Heichi navid. What's the mitzias? What are you going to do? ninkot chada. You're going to take one tiny little peppercorn. They're 3 millimeters in diameter. They're tiny. Lo min karela kichasa. No one's going to even know that you're holding anything. How can that be the case? That's the mitzvah. Doesn't really make sense. And if you want to say, okay, maybe we should take more ninkot trei otlasa, that can't be either, because the Torah was spoken the singular, pre-eitz hadar. Says the Gemara, echad amar rachman v'lo shnayim v'shlosha peros, hilkach lo efshar. So the Gemara says, you're right that it checks off the boxes in regards to the parameters of the bark tasting somewhat like the fruit. However, in Metzias, it doesn't work. In Metzias, what we're not able to do is use the peppercorn because you wouldn't even know that you're holding it. And therefore, the Torah defaults to the more logical answer is that this is a type of fruit that, yes, the bark tastes a little bit like the tree, but it's visible and it's only one fruit. And what is that? That is an esrog. The Gemara is now going to go on a whole set of a play of words on what hadar means. We know the pasuk says pre-eitz hadar, kapos tamarim. So here the Gemara says a couple of options as to what hadar means. Rebbe Omer, al tikri hadar ela hadir. The play on words is that don't say it's hadar, beautiful, but say it's like hadir, like a pen, the pen where animals are kept. Ma dir zeh, just like a pen of animals. Yesh bo gedol muktanim, you have animals that are large and animals that are small, and as well, tamimu mubale mumin, and you have animals that are perfectly unblemished and animals that have blemishes. Hachanami, here too, by an esrog, yesh bo gedol muktanim, tamimu mubale mumin. Common denominator. So instead of saying hadar, we're going to say hadir. And the common denominator that Rebbe is trying to highlight is that just like you have tanim, gedolim, tmimin, and bali mumin in regards to the deer, in regards to animals, the same exact thing is true in regards to esrogim. We know people look at esrogim. We're going to learn about some of the blemishes today. That if you have a blemish, your esrog is not kosher. Sometimes it's le'ikuva. Sometimes it's just a chatchila b'di'evet. But sometimes it's me'ake. So says the Gemara, Atu sha'ar peros, less behu gedolim uktanim tamimun ubale mumin. What kind of tzushtel are you making, Rebbe? Because you're saying that the word hadar sounds like the word hidur, sounds like the word hadir, and that in a pen you have animals that are both gadol katan and tamim and bale mumin. So therefore it must be an esrog mehechatesi. Every type of fruit ever has all of these same exact things. We've seen tomatoes that look like there are two that are fused together. We see problems all the time. You see large tomatoes and small tomatoes, and you see perfectly fine tomatoes. So mehechatesi that we're talking about an esrog. So says the Gemara as follows: Ela hachi kamar. We're 1/3 of the way down Lamed Hey Amud Aleph. This is really what Rebbe meant. Ad shebain ketanim adayin gedolim kayamim. What's unique about the esrog tree, and the reason why we are comparing it to a deer, to a pen where there are animals, is that while it's true that there are new esrogim growing on the tree, at that very same time, there are very old esrogim growing on the tree. Namely, the harvesting time for an esrog tree is very wide, and that's different than other animals. And therefore, we compared it to a deer, to a pen where there are animals, because no, not all fruits have very old and very young fruits on the tree at the same time. Most fruits grow in season, and that's not true here. They grow in a much wider span of time. Then says the Gemara, Rabbi Abahu Amar, Al Tikri Hadar Ella Hadar. Don't read it as Hadar, beautiful. Read it as Hadar, where it lives, the place that it lives, namely Davar Shadar Be'ilana Mishana Lashana, something that grows on the tree annually. And that's a play on the words, one that we saw already. And after shiur on Shabbos, I shared this with our Balkori, with Bill Cantor, that sometimes the difference between a kamatz and a patach could be the difference in the word. The word hadar means beautiful. The word hadar means one who lives. Very different words. And therefore, Baalei Kriya have a burden of responsibility to make sure that they don't make these types of mistakes. It's not even easy to correct, because unless you're a Baki and Diktuk, you don't always know when to correct. But here, if this is true that hadar and hadar are different words, that's mamish and nafkamina. You're not yotzei kriyas Torah. It's a big problem. So gabayim have to know diktuk very well. It's a big responsibility. Almost halfway down, a little bit less. Ben Azai Omer al tikri hadar ela idur. Totally different word. Shekain belashon Yavani in Greek korin lamayim idur, because there's something about water in Greek that is similar to the word idur, and that's connected to our word hadar. Ve'ezehu. What are we to? Ve'ezu shagadol al kol mayim. What type of fruit grows, what type of fruit tree grows with all kinds of water? Have omer ze esrog. And that brings us to the two dots. But what does this mean? That it grows with any water? Last I checked, you can use any kind of water with every kind of tree. So this is a discussion in the Meforshim. And some of the Meforshim explain that even water that's not clean, the esrog tree will still be able to utilize it. Mashain case of other trees will not. Ayin sham in some of the Meforshim. Two dots halfway down, our Mishnah, and speaking about esrog, said shel hashera v'shel ir nidachas pasal, that if the lulav came from a tree that was worshipped for avodah zarah, or from a community where most people worshipped avodah zarah, that does not work. My taima. What is the reason as to why an esrog from those places would not be kosher? The answer is Kavan de la Sreifa Kai, since that tree or that place has already been dedicated and designated, I should say, as a place that's L'Sreifa Kai, therefore Kisusi Michtas Shiure. That means that once it's been paskined upon that it's Chayv Sreifa, so then we don't look at it anymore. Then it's no longer roi to be used for a mitzvah. The next two dots, Shel Orla Pasal, and this is a question I asked in the Mishnah. Who cares if it's Orla? Who cares if it's Truma Tmeya? Why would we not use an esrog? It's a perfect, beautiful esrog. Why would we not use an esrog if it's not halachically okay to eat? Who cares? You're not eating it. My taima, what is the reason for such a halacha? So that says the Gemara, Pligi ba, Rav Chia bar Avin v'Rav Asi. These names are important to remember because a little bit later in the Gemara, we're going to try to figure out who of these two Amoraim said which of the following two shitas. Chad Amar, one of them said that the reason why an esrog that's from an orla tree in the first 3 years of a new tree is pasul, Chad Amar lefi she'ein ba heter achila. One says that we consider it a psul in esrog. It doesn't have to be anything other than the fact that because it's aser be'achila, it's also aser to be used for the mitzvah. And one says, no, it's because it doesn't have a halachic status of any monetary value because an orla tree is a zero. It'll be helpful down the road, but the esrog right now is worth nothing. So these are the different shitas. Then the Gemara says about these two shitas, kasal kadaite, we might have thought that each of these bal shitas, the one who says that the orla tree, the esrog from an orla tree is pasul because of the first sheet of the Gemara says is that there's no heter achila, and the second one is because it has no financial value. We might have thought that each sheet held the other one was not relevant. Kasal kadaite, what might I have thought that man debay heter achila, one who says that we require that an esrog have a heter achila, otherwise it won't work. We might have assumed that he held lo bay din mamon, that he does not require that it have a financial value. Uman debay din mamon, and according to the one who says that we need a fruit to have financial value in order for it to be used as an esrog, but lo boy heter achila, but it doesn't have to be edible, halachically speaking. So says the Gemara, if that's our assumption, we have a big question. Of course, the Gemara introduced this with kasal kadaite, which by and large means we're about to say something that we're going to reject, and that's in fact the case. Says the Gemara, you can't say that each of these Baal Shitas hold mutually exclusively that their Shita is right and the other is wrong, because look at our Mishnah. Tanan, what does our Mishnah say? On the bottom of Lamed Daled Amud Beis, it says, Shel Truma Tmeya Pasal, that if you have an esrog that's Truma Tmeya, that you're not allowed to use it for the mitzvah of esrog. So Zog the Gemara as follows. The Gemara asks, Vishlam Alamanda Amar Lefisha Ein Boheter Achila Shapir. I could understand that if you say that by an orla tree, the reason why you can't eat it is because there's no heter achila, well, then I could understand why you would say that you're not allowed to use an esrog when it's truma tmeya. Maskim, I understand. But but if you say that the reason why we're not allowed to use an esrog from an orla tree is because it has no financial value, and that's also the reason why we would have assumed that an esrog that is from Truma Tmeya cannot be used as well. Why would that be a rationale to say that you can't use an esrog from Truma Tmeya? After all, Truma Tmeya, even though you can't eat it, does have financial value. After all, says the Gemara, 2/3 of the way down, Hare Mesika Tachas Tavshilo. You can't eat it, but you can use it as fuel for a flame. So says the Gemara, that doesn't make sense. And therefore, you can't assume that the two shitas are mutually exclusive. Ella, says the Gemara, you're right. Ella beheter achila kule almalo pligi de boinan. Everyone agrees. Both of the shitas of the Amoraim, Rav Chia bar Avin and Rav Asi, they both agree that heter achila ba'inan, that it must be that the food is in fact edible. Kule alma achila kule beheter achila kule amalo pligi de ba'inan. Ki pligi. Where do these Amoraim, Rav Chia bar Avin and Rav Asi, have a machlokas? Ki pligi bedin mamon. Whether or not there is a secondary requirement of the food having financial value. Mar savar heter achila ba'inan. din mamon lo ba'ina. According to one shita, one shita says, yes, of course, that it needs to be edible to be an esrog, but I don't need for it to have any financial value. Umar savar din mamon nami ba'ina, that you need both. So here is what the Gemara is saying. We have two cases in our Mishnah where the food is puzzle. The food that is puzzle is a case of orla, and the food that is puzzle is a case of trumat meya. And what the Gemara is saying right now is like this. Everyone agrees that in order for an esrog to be used for a mitzvah, it has to be edible. There is a machlokes, however, as to whether or not there's a second criterion, which is whether or not that food also has to have a financial value. And then says the Gemara, "Mai beinaihu." What is the difference between these two shitas? Says the Gemara, "Ika beinaihu." Another case in our Mishnah of Meiser Sheni b'Yerushalayim v'Aliba de Rab Meir. In regards to the case of Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim, according to Rab Meir, how would it play out? What would the difference be between these two shitas? Lamanda amar lefi she'ein bo heter achila. According to those who say that we only require that there should be a heter achila, but we don't require financial value. Hariyesh bo heter achila. That should be mutter to use Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim according to Rab Meir. But Lamanda amar lefi she'ein bo din mamon. But according to the one who says that in addition to the fact that we need the food to be kosher, we also need it to have financial value. That's a problem because Meiser Sheni mamon gavahu. That's not your money. That money belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yes, you have a heter to eat it. You're allowed to eat it. You should eat it. But that doesn't mean that Meiser Sheni belongs to you because it doesn't. It was money that was made kodesh. It was you gave something over, and then you wanted to bring it to Yerushalayim. You were machalal alamos. You made the coins holy, and then you brought the coins to Yerushalayim, and then bought food there. You should eat it absolutely, but it's not your money. So therefore, that's how the Gemara says that there would be a nafkamina between these two shitas. And the Gemara's conclusion here is that when our Mishnah says that a food is not allowed to be eaten when it's aser be'achila, yes, that's true, but there's a second possible layer of the machlokes, and that is whether or not we have a secondary criterion of whether or not there's also additionally a need to have fiscal value, financial value to the esrog. Next, we saw in this last section that there was a machlokes, and this is at the 2 dots above, about 12 lines up. There's a machlokes between Rav Chia bar Avin and Rav Asi as to why orla was puzzle. We saw that one shita held because we needed the food to have a heter achila, and we saw another shita that said that we need the food to have financial value. And the Gemara says about 15 lines or so from the bottom of the page, tistayim. We should be able to conclude that it was de Rabbi Asi, de Amar lefi she'ein ba din mamon. So that's what we should assume, that Rav Asi was the one who said that the reason why in our Mishnah that orla was not allowed to be used for the mitzvah of esrog, an esrog from that tree is not allowed to be used. He must be the one who says that the reason why is because an orla tree, the fruit on it for the first 3 years has no financial value. Where do we see this from? So it says the Gemara as follows. The Amar Rav Asi. Rav Asi says, Esrog shall Meiser Sheni l'dibur Rav Meir. If you have an esrog that is Meiser Sheni according to Rav Meir, he says the halacha is Ein Adam Yotzei Ba'Yodecha Vasu B'Yom Tov, and l'divrei Chachamim Adam Yotzei Ba'Yodecha Vasu B'Yom Tov Tistayim. What do we see according to Rav Meir? That a person is not allowed to eat a Meiser Sheni esrog. You're not allowed to use it. Not eat it. You're not allowed to use it, even though it's Meiser Sheni. But what's the din of Meiser Sheni? Meiser Sheni is allowed to be eaten. So what does that show you? By virtue of the fact that Rav Meir holds in this context of an esrog shel Meiser Sheni that it's ein adam yotzei decha vasu b'yom tov, that you cannot fulfill your obligation with an esrog, and it's mutter to eat Meiser Sheni. Therefore, by definition, it must be that Rav Asi was the one who held that that we are talking about a concern about financial value, tistayim, therefore we can make that conclusion. Now we've concluded that piece, and we're going to now analyze the last line that we said of Rav Asi, the line that we used to prove that Rav Asi was of the opinion that the concern of an orla tree was that it needed financial value. Now let's dig in and analyze that more. Gufa. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Asi, this line that we just saw, plus a little bit more. The line that we just saw was like this, Amar Rav Asi, Esrog shel Meiser Sheni l'dibur Rav Meir, ein adam yotzei ba'Yodecha vasu b'Yom Tov, that when it comes to an esrog that's Meiser Sheni, so we said in our Mishnah that one is not able to be yotzei, the halacha of an esrog if it's Meiser Sheni, because as Rav Asi had mentioned, it had a din of not having any financial value. And that's part one. Here's part two. We didn't see this earlier, but we do see it now. Matzah shel Meiser Sheni. What about that according to Rav Meir? If you have matzah of Meiser Sheni, right? So that's what you dedicated to the Beis Hamikdash. You bring the coins to Shalim, and now you have you buy matzah with it. So according to Rav Meir, he says Ein Adam Yotze Bo Yidei Chavasa B'Pesach, because it's Meiser Sheni, presumably for the same reason, because he holds that there's no financial value to Meiser Sheni, and because it's Mamon Gavoa, it belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now the Divrei Chachamim, and they argue and say Adam Yotze Bo Yidei Chavasa B'Pesach. That's case 2. So case number 1 was the Esrog of Meiser Sheni. Case number 2 is the Matzah of Meiser Sheni. Here's case number 3. One of the last of the short lines here on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, says the Gemara. What about Isa? What about dough? But the dough is Shel Meiser Sheni. So then the Divrei Reb Meir, what does he hold? That because it's Meiser Sheni and it's Mamon Gavo and it has no value, therefore he holds it's P'tur Min HaChala. Because as we know, Reishi Sariso Seichem, it has to be your challah in order to be chayiv in it. But this isn't your challah. You're allowed to eat it, but it's not your challah. You're pater from being mafresh challah. And Ladivrei Chachamim chayeves bechala, and according to the Chachamim, they hold that you would still be chayev. So now these are the 3 cases that Rav Asi presented. Now Maskif lo Rav Papa Bishlama. I understand the case of Isa because Ksiv Reishi Sariso Sechem. I know that when it comes to dough, that there is a din by dough by the mitzvah of challah that you have to be the owner, and if you're not the owner, you're not chayev. You're just not going to be chayiv in Isa to be mafresh challah because of Reishi Sariso Seichem. And by Esrog as well, I also know Nami Ksiv Lachem Mishel Lachem. We saw this drasha already, that when it comes to the mitzvah of Esrog, there's also a din of Lachem, which means that it has to be yours, explaining yet again that if you don't own it, it can't have any financial value for you. It's not yours. But the third case is the most problematic. It actually was presented as the middle case here, which was matzah. 2 lines from the bottom on Lamed Hey Amud Aleph, matzah. Miksiv, is there a pasuk in Chumash that says matzah? All of a sudden we have a new din of lachem by matzah. That's not true. There is no din of lachem by matzah. So says the Gemara, hang on, just 1 second. Amar Rabba Bar Shmuel, v'yitema Rav Yemar Bar Shlamya, one of these Amoraim had the following Gzeira Shava. Asya lechem lechem. They do taka bring a Gzeira Shava. And this Gzeira Shava does indicate that there's a din of lachem by matzah. How does it work? Ksiv hacha, in regards to the mitzvah of matzah, what does the Torah say? Lechem oni. Uchsiv Hasam, turning to the top of Daf Lamed Hey Amud Beis, and as mentioned, we're going to go until a few lines before the end of the page. What's the second part of the Gzeira Shava? The second part of the Gzeira Shava is a pasuk about Truma. The pasuk reads, V'haya be'och lechem lechem ha'aretz, and the whole pasuk reads, V'haya be'och lechem lechem ha'aretz, tarimu tiruma l'Hashem. Tarimu siruma l'Hashem. You should bring Truma from the ground. Ma lehalan mishal lachem. Just like by Truma, we have a din of lachem. So too, says the Gemara, Velo Mishal Meiser, and it can't be from Meiser. Avkan Mishal Lachem, Velo Mishal Meiser. It has to be yours. It has to be yours to be able to fulfill this mitzvah. So that's how the Gemara indicates that, in fact, that there is even a mitzvah of Lachem, a din of Lachem by matzah. And that explains how Rav Asi, in all 3 cases, in the case of Esrog, in the case of matzah, and in the case of Isa, in all 3 cases, he is of the opinion that if there is no financial value to those items because all of them are Meiser Sheni, and Meiser Sheni is Mamon Gavoa, the money belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In all of those cases, he would hold within the camp of Rav Meir that one is pater in all of those cases. Says the Gemara, Lema Misayeh, maybe I can bring a raya to the Shita of Rav Asi. Right, Rav Asi brought all 3 of these cases, but here's a brisa. Rav Asi was an early Amora, but here's a brisa that says what Rav Asi says, and this would be a great support to prove the sheet of Rav Asi, because remember we had a machlokes in the Amoraim. One Amora said that we were talking about heter achila, whether or not the esrog would be permissible to be used. No, it's not, because it's from an orla tree. That was shita number 1. And the other shita, which we established was Rav Asi, was that it had to have financial value. Now, if this brisa supports Rav Asi, we've answered our question in full, and the other Amora is knocked out unless he can also bring a brisa. So says the Gemara, Lema Misayele. Maybe we have a raya brura for the shita of Rav Asi. How so? Says the Gemara, what does the brisa say? Quote, Isa shal meiser sheni p'tura min achala divrei Reb Meir v'chacham amor m'chayeves b'chala. So we see that by meiser sheni you're p'tura from chala. What does that show you? That shows us the shita of Rav Asi, that because it has no financial value, we see that within the camp of Rav Meir, we see that you're going to be pater. So that's a beautiful raya. So says the Gemara, I think you missed something. That was a perfect quote. What do you mean? Lema misayele? That's rhetorical. He, Those two things are the same exact line. Of course, this is a raya berura for the sheet of Rav Asi. Why wouldn't, what's the lema misayel? You should have just said Kiditanya. What's the lema? Maybe I'm not so sure if this is such a good marimakum. It's a perfect marimakum. Overlap the words. They're identical, one to the next, one brisa to the statement of Rav Asi. Says the Gemara, it's not really so true. Ella, says the Gemara, midahava pligi beha, not beha nami pligi. Maybe this brisa, we have to make a jump because Rav Asi brought us three cases in the previous brisa, in the previous statement. He brought us three cases, one of esrog, one of matzah, and one of isa. Yet here the brisa only speaks about one. So Rav Asi is taking it further. And what he's saying is, midahava pligi beha, nami pligi. We're having it, that machlokes over here, so odilma, maybe shiny isa. Or maybe we would say, no, this brisa doesn't really follow Rav Asi because it doesn't have all three cases of Rav Asi. Maybe it's only the case of Isa, and that's why the brisa excluded the case of matzah and the case of esrog, because Isa is different. The Amar Kra Risosechem Trezimne. It says it twice, and therefore maybe we should assume that this case is unique, and therefore this brisa is not a raya for Rav Asi. So yes, we know what Rav Asi's shita is, but we don't have a raya brewer that Rav Asi is right over the dissenting opinion. That brings us to the two dots about 10 lines down on Lamed Hey, Amud Beis. Says the Gemara shel truma tmei apostle. That, of course, we know. Delesba heter achila. That we know fundamentally. We already established this earlier today by Orla. Is that if the food is not mutter to eat, then absolutely it cannot be used for the mitzvah of an esrog. What about b'shel truma tahora lo yito? If it's truma tahora, what is the problem? It's tahora. It's edible. It may not be edible for every Jew under the sun, but it's edible. Kohanim can eat it, but let it be. Why can't we say that if it's truma tahora, that you can use an esrog? Let's say that's the only one left. So our Mishnah said that you could be makil if need be. But why was it a problematic in the first place? It says the Gemara, v'shel truma tahora lo yito. Why should one not use an esrog for the mitzvah? Use an esrog from a truma tahora for the mitzvah of the lulav and esrog. Says the Gemara, that as well as a machlok, as pligi bar Rav Ami v'Rav Asi, the same Rav Asi but a different counterpart. Chad amar mipnei shemachshira. One of these Amoraim had the concern of being machshira. What does that mean? We've learned many times throughout Shas already that there are liquids that can bring to lidei hechsher, that there are 7 liquids, the acronym of Yad Shachat Dam. Any of these 7 liquids, when in contact, can lead to tuma. And out of concern that this truma tahora would become tameh, so one of these Amoraim is indicating that we're not allowed to do the mitzvah of lulav and esrog, and to make an esrog from truma tahora out of concern that maybe your hands will be wet. People used to keep their lulavim in water, and then their hands would be wet, and then they would touch the esrog, and there would be tuma on their hands, and they would create a problem. So therefore, we don't do it. That's one shita. And another shita holds you're going to keep picking up the esrog and putting it down. You pick it up for Hallel, you're going to put it back down. You pick it up for Hoshanos. There's 7 out of the 8 days, whatever it is, you're picking it up all the time. And sometimes you want to pick it up just to look at it, just to smell. It's going to get dirty. It's mafsida. You're going to ruin it. So it says the Gemara, what's the difference between these two shitas? The shita that says that an esrog that's truma tahora should not be used, one of whom says we're concerned about tuma, and the other which says that it might just be mafsida, you might ruin it. The difference is kigon shakara lehashem chutz miklipas achitzona. You were korei ala Hashem. You determined, you established something to be truma, but you only took part of the fruit to be the truma. You excluded the very thick shell. If you were to cut an esrog in half, you'd see that the actual peel is particularly thick, no comparison to a lemon, much thicker. So chut miklipas achitzona. So the manda amar mipnei shemachshira. Mipnei shemachshira ika lamanda ika kama and lamanda amar mipnei shemafsida leka. According to the one of machshira, because the outer part, the peel, was excluded in establishing this fruit as truma, so therefore you can pour water all you want. The inside is the problem, and touching the outside of the peel won't be problematic. And according to the sheet of mipnei shemafsida, that you might start ruining it, yeah, this could still lead to it getting ruined by picking it up and putting it down. This brings us to the 2 dots, 1/3 of the way down Lamed Hey Amud Beis. Let's continue. The not al kasher. However, b'di'eved, if you took an esrog from truma tahora, it would still work. And why? Lamanda amr mipnei she'ein bo heter achila. According to the concern that we saw by Orla and by Truma Tmeya, that the food has to be actual food, halachic food. This is halachic food and you can eat it. So harei yesh baheter achila. That's totally fine. But and as well, lamanda amar lefi she'ein badin mamon. And according to the one who says that in order for a food to be considered edible, it also has to have financial value. So no problem, Harei Yesh Badin Mamon, because it has a financial value to the Kohanim. It was very valuable to them. So therefore, it's fine. But lechatchila, we should avoid it because of either being machshir tuma or ruining the fruit. What about Vishel Demai? Vishel Demai, we said, is an esrog that was given by an Am Haaretz, and we always have a suffix by Am Haaretz as to whether or not they were ma'aser properly. So it says the Gemara, my time of the Beis Hillel. Why was Beis Hillel lenient to say that an esrog that comes from an Am Haaretz can be used for the mitzvah? So Zog the Gemara. My time at the Beis Hillel, since theoretically a person could be mafkir all of their nechasim, and he can be poor. And then once he's poor, and there is a din by demai that if a person is an ani, then we are not concerned that the Am Haaretz was not me'aser. We assume he is if the person's poor. So since in theory one could relinquish all of his property and then regain them if he so desires, hashtanami, here now, even if he doesn't relinquish all of his property to make himself into an ani, lochem karina bay, you're all good. Everything works out just fine. It is still considered to be eligible for you. You're still able to use this as your esrog ditznan. This is a Mishnah, and we will soon see that this is a Mishnah only according to Beis Hillel. What does the Mishnah write? That yes, you are absolutely allowed to give demai, this questionable as to whether or not it's been tithed fruit from an Am Haaretz. You are allowed to use that if you're poor. You're also allowed to use that if you're an achsanya. If you were a soldier and you were staying in someone's house, kind of like what we have in our country, the quartering act. In times of war, people are allowed to stay over in certain communities and benefit from the resources. Beis Shammai says, no, I totally disagree with you. Ani lo achil demai. Ditznan, ein machil en ho'anim. Demai, ve'esach sanoim. Demai, you're not allowed to feed them. V'amar Ravuna, Tana, Beis Shammai omrim, ein machil esanim, ve'esach sanoim demai. Beis Hillel omrim machil esanim demai, ve'esach sanoim demai. So a couple of braysos that indicate a split between whether or not we assume halachically that demai, which is a suffix of whether or not it was meusar, as to whether or not we are allowed to give it to a poor person. Beis Hillel is lenient, and Beis Shammai is machmir, and that plays out in our Mishnah when it comes to demai. Shal Meiser Sheni B'Yerushalayim, we already spoke about this at some length, says the Gemara as follows. According to the concern which the Gemara says earlier in the name of either Ravami or Ravasi, that we're afraid of this esrog, which is Truma Tahora, or in this case, Meiser Sheni, we're afraid of it contracting Tuma, Harei Machshira. That's a big problem, and therefore we do try to avoid using peiros that are Meiser Sheni, using an esrog that's Meiser Sheni. And the Manda Amar Mipnei Shemafsida, Harei Mafsida, we should be concerned about that also. So therefore, not much of a heter here. We did as well say by Meiser Sheni that Ve'im not al kasher. Why? The Manda Amar Mipnei Shein ba heter achila. According to the one who said that the primary concern is whether or not the food is edible. So then Dibriako, everyone agrees that you can eat Meiser Sheni, that's for sure. And the Manda Amar Levi Shein Badin Mamon, and according to the one who says that the primary concern about a food is about monetary money, that will work out only according to the Rabbanan, because as we saw from Ravasi earlier within the Shita of Rav Meir, that there is no value because it's Mamon Gavoa. But according to the Rabbanan, it does have a halachic status of money. So here we needed to touch a little bit because it doesn't work according to all opinions. According to Rav Meir, who is of the opinion that the Mamon of Meiser Sheni is Mamon Gavoa, he would argue with our Mishnah and say, no, that Meiser Sheni can never be used for an esrog. An esrog can never be used if it comes from Meiser Sheni because it doesn't have a halachic status of financial value because it's not yours, it's Mamon Gavoa. Ma'ashein came the Rabbanan say that they can be lenient, and therefore our Mishnah Hamani, it must be the Rabbanan. Then we said also Chazazis that if there are these kinds of boils, that one is obligated to make sure that it's not too much. If it's rov, it's a problem. If it's less than rov, so then it's okay. So then the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chizda, Davar Zer Rabbeinu Hagadol Omro. Rabbeinu Hagadol, as we learned the other day, is Rav, and the same line as we saw at the end, and Hamakom Yehei Be'ozro, that a Kadosh Baruch Hu should be of help to him. Lo Shanu. When do we say that a majority of the esrog is covered in these chazazios, in these little boils, and that it's puzzle, that's ela b'makom echad. That's only when it's all concentrated in one lump. It looks kind of like a mass of all of these boils in one spot. That's 51% of the esrog. Avon, if it's spread out, b'shnayim u'shlosha mekomos, it's 2 or 3 places, and all 3 of the places are 17% of the esrog, and that leads us to more than half, 51%. If it's in that many mekomos, then kosher. So Amalei Rava, no way. That's not possible. Ade Rabba, if you have all of the chazazis spread out, it looks like something that's spotted, and that violates the din of hadar, as we've seen a couple of times already in this Masechta. To have something that's spotted is not kishmak, and that's not appropriate for the Dalamim Mupasal. So therefore, says the Gemara, you're absolutely right. Elai Itmar, if you're going to quote that statement from Rav Chizda about Rab, do it right. Elai Itmar Aseifa Itmar Al Miuto Kasher. So the Mishnah said a little bit later in the Mishnah that, yeah, if it's going to be that also chazis on rubo, on most of it, then it's going to be puzzle. But what if also chazis on miuto? Let's say only 20% has the boils. So then on the leniency, on the kasher, that's where we have the statement of Rav Chizda. There, al miuto kasher, if only a small portion of the esrog is covered in these dots, says the Gemara, Amar Rav Chizda, davar zer rabbeinu gadol amro, v'hamakom yehi be'oto. Rav said this, may Hashem protect him. Lo shanu ela b'makom echad. When are we lenient? When do we say al miuto is kasher? That's only true when all of the dots are collected in one area. Aval b'shnayim u'shloshim mekomos. Once they begin to be in a variety of places on the esrog, no. Then havalei kimanuma pasol. That's what Rav was teaching us. That's what Rav Chizda was quoting Rav to say, that at the end of our Mishnah, when we're lenient in regards to the minority coverage of the chazazis, in those cases we add the qualification. It's not just a question of minority; it's also minority and concentrated in one place. But once it spreads out, that's menumar, that's spotted, and that's unacceptable. Last line for the night. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava ve'al chotmo afilu b'mashu nami pasal. This is where, this one line of the Gemara is where a lot of us have learned the habit of looking at the top third approximately of an esrog and looking for spots. Because the Gemara says al chotmo, the chotem is determined on the esrog shape when it goes like this, when it kind of tapers down like that. As it begins to taper, that's the chotem. So on that top section of the Gemara of the esrog, that's what we're concerned about. Afilu b'mashu nami pasal. And with that, we will stop. Wishing you all a beautiful night. Tomorrow we will be in person. As of now, we don't have someone to host the Daf Yomi shiur and the chizuk for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So as of now, that will take place in Makor. Of course, please feel free to reach out to me or Ari Shabbat if you have any interest. Wishing you all a beautiful night. Take care.